When I was a teenager in Greensboro at Lawndale Baptist Church, we had an old evangelist come and preach, Vance Havner, a longtime Baptist evangelist. And I remember he used to like to say after the choir would sing, if that doesn't set you on fire, your wood must be wet. And so, choir, thank you for that. And I expected that today. I expected good music. I expected wonderful worship. I expected it to feel good to stand in this pulpit as it did every Sunday that I did as your pastor from 1990 to 97. And every time I have stood in this pulpit since, whether it was for a wedding or a funeral or homecoming or some other event, I expected it to feel good. And it has today. And I expected good food that I know we will get following the service. And some of you may not know that in seminary, we are taught that when you're the homecoming preacher, it's okay to preach till 1 o'clock. Dave, did you learn that lesson like I did? You forgot? Okay. Well, I hadn't forgot, but I won't do that to you. And I expected just wonderful friendliness as you've given me and good hospitality, but I have missed hospitality from one place today. And I'm not surprised about this. One person has not shown me just kind hospitality today. And Dave, that is your sound man, Kent Fowler. That's why I was stumbling around a while ago, because your sound man, Kent Fowler, who happens to be an NC State fan, Kent gave me my lapel mic with a dead battery today. Kent, I expected no less from you, my friend. So thank you. But we got it straight. So that's why I was stumbling around in the balcony a while ago, getting a fresh battery. Thanks to Sammy for going to get some batteries a moment ago. But thank you for the invitation, the privilege, the opportunity to be here today. Dave, thank you for being the one to extend the invitation. He did last year, and I had agreed to come last year. And then the dedication, the date of the dedication for my twin grandbabies, Bo and MJ, got changed to where I couldn't come. And so thank you for reissuing an invitation this year, and to all of you for your friendliness and openness and welcomeness always to me. You need to know that what you did for me between 1990 and 97, when I came here as a 27-year-old pastor with one son, and Martha coming here. Chess was 6 months old when we came, and then Addison and Luke were born while we were here. What you did for me and us as a family, but especially me as a young pastor, is you showed me just how joyful it can be to be a pastor. And you're that kind of church. And you were that kind of church to me from the age of 27 to 34 before I left to be called to Baptist Children's Homes. But you need to know how you impacted my life as a pastor. And you gave me something that was just beautiful as an experience in a church such as you are. So to all of you, I thank you who were a part of the church at that time or who joined the church during this time. There are lots of faces missing who were a part of the church during my tenure. But you did something beautiful for me as your pastor. And I am so grateful for the privilege to have served in Chadbourn twice. And I know there have been others who have done what I have done, served two different churches in the same town of two different denominations. I don't know of anybody else, but I know somebody had to have done that. But I've had that privilege to be in Chadbourn twice with two different very good churches. And I'm grateful for the two opportunities from 90 to 97 and 13 to 18 to serve in this community and to have been a part of the Chadbourn community in different ways just outside of the church. When I was your pastor, I enjoyed serving in the community, whether that was serving as the president of the Strawberry Festival Association in 1994 or serving on the Rotary Club and as its president, and serving on the board of directors of Habitat for Humanity, and serving on a program we started at the community college called Elder Learners. And I was on that board and also taught some classes for senior adults here in Columbus County at Southeastern. I don't think that program is still going, but that was a real privilege. But one of my most awesome privileges I had during the time I served as your pastor was serving as the chaplain for the Columbus County Sheriff's Department. And during my tenure, I remember Jimmy Ferguson was elected sheriff in 1994, and as far as I know, is the only member of this church to have been elected sheriff. I am aware that from 1954 to 58, Yachty Pridgeon's husband served as a sheriff after retiring from the Highway Patrol, but I'm not sure he was a member of this church. But Jimmy Ferguson was a member, was elected sheriff in 1994. He knew of my love of law enforcement, and he gave me the privilege to serve as the chaplain of his sheriff's department. And I loved that privilege. That gave me a strong kinship to the law enforcement community of Columbus County, still today. And today is a sad day in the law enforcement community in Columbus County and for all of this county, as Trooper Kevin Conner will be laid to rest. And I would love for us to do something special in his memory today. And because of my own kinship still that I feel to the law enforcement community, enjoyed that while I was serving at Chadbourne Presbyterian Church, I would love for us to have just a moment of silence. And I want to do it this way. Jimmy Ferguson gave me an official chaplain's badge when I was the chaplain for the Columbus County Sheriff's Department. I wore this when I was serving in an official capacity as the chaplain. And I would love for us to have a moment of silence and add in Jimmy's memory, and as a part of the law enforcement community, would you make your way up here? I haven't asked her to do this, but would you make your way and join me here at the front, just as a representative of the law enforcement community, while we have a special moment to remember Trooper Conner and him giving his life in service this week. I know that his wife Miranda was a student of Sharon's, and Miranda's mother was your first, you said, scholarship recipient at the college. And I know you're very close to that family, and others of you are very close. Knew Kevin, know Miranda. She was a strawberry queen. But it is a sad day for our community. And let us take a moment this morning to remember Kevin and his service and his life given in service. I'm going to ask you if you're able to stand today for this moment of silence, and then I will have a prayer with us. Lord, to give one's life is the greatest giving anybody can do. Your son did that for all of us. And Kevin Conner, a part of our community, did that for this community this week. He lost his life in service. He gave his life. And Lord, that just wells up feelings of sadness, anger within us. It wells up feelings of just empathy and sympathy for his wife and children and his family and his friends, some here today. But Lord, we remember him. We give you thanks for him and for his service. And Lord, as we will read in this psalm in just a moment about your presence that is never far from us at all, it's never away from us. May that presence be what carries Miranda and her children and this community forward. And Lord, we thank you today for Kevin Conner, and we remember him. Amen. I invite you to turn to our scripture text, Psalm 139, that I'll read in just a moment, but just a couple of comments about my current work and ministry at St. Andrews University. Yes, it's very much involved with the athletics of St. Andrews. I'm the keeper of the information for athletics. I'm the one who sends out and gives out the information, whether it's putting it on our website, writing press releases, talking to the media, but also keeping statistics and just dealing with information as the sports information person. But there's also ministry I'm finding, and I knew there would be. And I just have to share with you just something that happened a couple of Sundays ago. There's a young lady who plays soccer for St. Andrews, and I was aware that she went to the same high school as my three boys, Chess, Addison, and Luke, North Davidson High School in Davidson County near Lexington. But I'd not met her, and I asked her one day to come to my office. This is 2 Sundays ago. I ran into she and her mother in the parking lot, and I asked her to come to my office, and I wanted to show her something. I have a little North Davidson football helmet that I keep on my desk, and she came in, and I showed that to her, and she smiled when she saw that, and I said, my 3 sons went to North Davidson High School, played football, and I happened to have a picture on my desk of the 3 of them and me when I had the privilege of saying a prayer at a Panthers game 4 years ago. We're standing on the sideline, and I showed her that picture. And she said, Luke. She said, you're Luke's dad? And I said, I sure am. And she said, I'm so sorry for your loss. Luke will have been deceased 2 years, coming up on the 29th. And she said, I am so sorry for your loss. She said, Luke and I, though he was a senior when I was a freshman, we became good friends. And she said, I remember on occasion, Luke didn't like people picking on me and would take up for me. And she said, just how wonderful to make that connection with you. And she said, this has his loss rocked my faith. She said, I know his death changed the lives of many of his friends. And she named 3 of them. One who was a pallbearer at his funeral that day, who carried his body in and out of that church. She said, I know it rocked his life. And he's still in school, though. And she said, Luke changed his life and the lives of these other 2 that she mentioned. And she said, I've struggled in my own faith. My faith has always been just faith of my mom and daddy, faith of my friends or my church, but not my own faith. And she said, I want it to be my own faith. And God opened a door beautifully 2 Sunday afternoons ago there in my office with Haley Griggs to talk to her about faith and to continue talking to her about faith. So there is a great intersection of faith and sports that can happen and will happen. And we'll talk about one this morning who has made that happen in his own life. But Psalm 139 is our text today. I invite you to follow along or to listen as the psalmist said, O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. You hem me in, behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain that knowledge. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. And if I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light around me become night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light to you. And then here 13 and 14. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made, and wonderful are your works that I know very well. And may God bless the reading of these words of Scripture. Many of you know that when I'm asked what CF stands for, my typical response is Carolina fan. But today it stands for Clemson football. And I had already chosen this sermon title before NC State got clobbered by Clemson yesterday. I'd already chosen the sermon title. Dave is a witness to that. He got my sermon title a week ago yesterday. But the sermon title, God Never Clemsoned, is our focus today. And why is that? Well, because I love the Clemson football coach, Dabo Swinney. Dabo Swinney was born William Christopher Swinney, 1969. He's 49 years old. But his younger brother couldn't say his name and tried to say that boy, and it came out Dabo. And so the name Dabo has stuck with Coach Swinney all through the years. And I love watching him coach. I love hearing him speak. And one of my dreams for my grandson, Bo, who, by the way, in case you don't know, is CF the Fifth. One of my dreams is for him to play football and play for Coach Swinney. By the time Coach Swinney probably is ready to retire, Bo will be about time to go into college. So I hope that'll happen. And when the day that my twin grandbabies were dedicated at Ardmore Baptist Church, the pastor carried Bo around the sanctuary, and the associate pastor carried MJ. And as Dr. Gordon carried Bo, he said, you know, the name Bo McDowell sounds like a good name for a Southeastern Conference quarterback. So just maybe, people think Coach Swinney will be at Alabama by then as the coach, his alma mater, but just maybe Bo McDowell will get to play, or any of my other grandsons that might come along will get to play for Coach Swinney. Someone gave me a gift on Father's Day of a book entitled Getting to Us, How Great Coaches Make Great Teams. And this is one of the best books I've ever read. And one of my own traditions with a book that's really good is I will get near the end and intentionally slow down so I don't have to finish the book, because I don't want it to end. And this is one of those. This is written by Seth Davis, who is a Duke graduate. Excuse me. And as I've said to people, I was expecting this being written by a Duke graduate to say, "See Spot Run," or something like that. But Seth Davis did pretty good in writing this book. So good, and I even hate to admit this in church today, he gave me a little respect for Coach K of Duke. He has a chapter of about 9 coaches, and I really enjoyed reading the chapter on Coach K from Duke, and did gain a little respect. And Donald Ray, I hope you'll speak to me after church, after me saying that. But he writes about these coaches. Coach K is one. Urban Meyer from Ohio State. Doc Rivers is pictured on the front, an NBA coach of the LA Clippers. And Dabo Swinney is pictured. And then some other coaches like Tom Izzo at Michigan State. But he writes about what he calls their peak profile. What he says, and what he says about these coaches is every one of them, whether they know it or not, has a peak, P-E-A-K, profile. And it's the letters P, E, A, and K, and what those letters stand for, that helps them get a team to us. And he says P stands for persistence, E, empathy, A, authenticity, K, knowledge. And he says all of those coaches use their peak profile to get their teams to us and to be maybe a championship team, as Dabo Swinney has done. But I love Dabo Swinney, and if you want to feel good, watch him dance after a Clemson victory in the locker room with his players. You can find plenty of YouTube videos of that, but I love watching that. I love hearing him speak after a game, and I well remember 3 years ago this month, Dabo Swinney and his team hosted Notre Dame. You might remember this because that area of South Carolina had about 16 inches of rain. And Notre Dame came to town, and Clemson squeaked out a win during that game. And it says in the book, and I remember his interview after that game on the field being packed with people. The writer says, Seth Davis says, armed with all of this knowledge, Swinney transformed Clemson football year by year, class by class, acronym by acronym that he used. It went from being a program that was overly reliant on a handful of flashy skill players to one that was able to slog it out in the trenches with the best of them. And he says that was embodied on October the 4th of 2015 when the Tigers won an all-time classic over Notre Dame in a downpour, 24-22. When it was over, Swinney stood on the field, mud splattered, and barked into a television reporter's live microphone. What I told him tonight was, listen, what I told the players, we give you scholarships, we give you stipends and meals and a place to live, we give you a nice uniform. I can't give you guts, I can't give you heart. Tonight it was BYOG, bring your own guts. And what a great statement. I see Roy Shade sitting out here. That reminds me of a time here when I was the pastor here. We were having a church event, speaking of BYOG and those letters. And I called Roy and said, Roy, we're having this event at church. It's BYOB. And Roy showed up with beer. And I said, Roy, BYOB is bring your own Bible. And I still remember the dumbfounded look on his face. Just had to, Roy. But Dabo Swinney can talk with the best of them. BYOG, he said after that game. And the author Seth Davis also says, nobody ever said Dabo Swinney was a man of few words. His speeches become stem winders. His tangents have tangents. Ask him a simple question, and he will embark upon a lengthy, meandering, disjointed, flighty disquisition that touches on a variety of topics, most of which you never ask him about, yet somehow ends up driving home his original point with remarkable eloquence. He is constantly buttonholing people, holding forth at meetings, chatting up employees, addressing his players in team meetings. His gift of gab keeps on giving. One of his players, Hunter Renfro, says he can just talk and talk and talk forever. Dabo Swinney has worked hard to get where he is, and it didn't come easy. He comes from a family in Alabama where his parents were married, and his dad was a businessman, suffered from alcoholism, and it says in the book about his dad that many times his drinking would get very bad. Dabo has an older brother and a younger brother. Tracy was almost through with college. Tripp had left for college, where he himself struggled with alcohol. But his dad would come home and be mean and drunk. The wife would confront him. The boys would have to hold him back so he wouldn't hurt her. And it says, at his worst, he would go on benders that kept him from home for days at a time. It was scary every time the phone would ring, Dabo's mother says. We wouldn't know where he was. I would just wait and hope that he would come back. Problem was, when he did come back, he'd sometimes toss lamps, punch walls, and break windows. One time he threw a Christmas tree clear across the room, and Carol would have no choice but to grab Dabo and drive away. Sometimes they spent the night in a motel. Sometimes they slept in a car. This was going on while Coach Swinney was in high school. And it says about him, and we need to hear this. Through it all, he found the strength to persist, soldiering off to school, pulling down excellent grades, even while sleeping in a car with his mother because of his dad's alcoholism. He pulled down excellent grades. He was trying to build a life for himself, Dabo was. He was embarrassed, hurt, angry, confused, all those things, but he was never defeated. So many times he'd say, Mama, don't worry, we'll be okay. It's going to work out. And Carol says, I always knew he was different. He always had that little personality and that little attitude. From the time he was born, he was a fighter. But his mother made the decision it was time to leave her husband, Ervil. She and Dabo rented an apartment. She got a job making $8 an hour. And this would have been in the mid to late 1980s. She was making $8 an hour, They rented their apartment. They fell behind and were evicted. She stayed at her mother's house. He stayed with friends' homes. But for the duration of his senior year, they were essentially homeless. He goes to college at the University of Alabama. And guess who became his roommate in his freshman year? Mama. And he and his mother, Carol, they shared a room. They shared a closet where they put up a broomstick where they could hang their clothes. And they shared a queen-size bed. And he did that for his mama. And every Sunday, she would cook a big pot of chicken and dumplings for the other apartment mates and other friends. And it would last for the whole week, he says, and keep them from all getting hungry. But Coach Swinney, as you know, became the head coach at Clemson after being an assistant coach there. And Coach Swinney, after Clemson lost the national championship game in 2016, they played out in Arizona. And it says about him, many coaches who suffer a painful loss would never want to watch the game again, much less a few hours after its conclusion. But he sat there in his hotel room in Arizona after that game on that night and watched the entire game again. He second-guessed himself a few times. He winced at a few mistakes that could have altered the outcome and not caused them to lose to Alabama. But he said after that, he watched the game, and when the replay ended, he packed his bag and left the room, no regrets, because they were flying back. But he said, and I quote, "It definitely hurts to lose. Don't get me wrong. But I try to teach our team not to let one moment make us lose sight of all the good." And here's his words that I want to take and interface with the psalmist words today. Swinney said to Seth Davis, "I live by the belief that God never says oops. My life has given me a clear perspective on what real problems are. But God never says oops. I made a mistake," because God didn't make a mistake. When you see the sermon title that God Never Clemsoned, it comes from this book and a word that was actually coined a few years ago when Dabo became the coach at Clemson. His team struggled. People wondered if Clemson had made a mistake in hiring him as the coach, but he turned things around. However, during the 3-year period from 2011 to 14, Clemson only lost a total of 6 games. But every time Swinney's teams were on the verge of greatness, they would suffer a crushing loss to some other team. In 2013, for example, the Tigers finished the season by making the Orange Bowl for the first time in 20 years, only to be embarrassed by West Virginia 70-33 in the Orange Bowl. And then their national title hopes the following year were derailed in a humiliating loss to Florida State by the score of 51-14. And that led to the coining of the term Clemson. I don't know if anybody remembers that or not, but the website Urban Dictionary defines Clemsoning as the act of failing miserably on a grand athletic stage or when the stakes are high. The verb Clemsoning. And Michael, I'm so sorry, Clemson didn't Clemson yesterday with NC State. But there was a Washington Post article that had a headline after that Florida State game that was this headline: "Against Florida State, Clemson's Clemsoning was the most Clemsoning Clemson ever Clemsoned." I'll say it again in case you didn't catch all of that. Against Florida State, Clemson's Clemsoning was the most Clemsoning Clemson ever Clemsoned. And from the psalmist, we get the message today that no, God never Clemsoned. He has never Clemsoned. And I would say to you today, He's never Clemsoned when it comes to you, in creating you, in making you what He has made you. I can say this to everyone here today and about everyone. God has never Clemsoned. when it comes to you and how he made you and how he created you. That's how the psalmist can say, it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And because God created us in his own image without any kind of failure, and because God never has to say, oops, we can move on through life with the greatest of hope, the greatest of victory, the greatest of faith. And we know that God, as the psalmist tells us, he's never away from us at all. He is always present. And we can count on that presence of him who created you and me. My seminary professor who in Old Testament was Dr. John Durham. Dr. Durham is one of the greatest Old Testament scholars, especially in Baptist life. He wrote the Broadman commentary for Psalms, and he says this about this psalm. The theme of Psalm 139 is above all else the presence of God. The poet who composed this psalm had come to so intimate a fellowship with Yahweh that his prayer represents the pinnacle statement in the Psalter, even in the whole of the Old Testament, on this often mentioned theme. Thus, this psalm can only be called the prayer of the presence, for it is that without a question. It is that without a question. Dr. Durham says, there is no place from which that presence is absent, and that Yahweh is therefore intimately and acquainted with every person and with all his or her ways and thoughts. And so we, who are created by God, never have to worry about that presence being away from us. And as I prayed in that prayer prior to the sermon, that Connor family never has to worry about that presence being away from them at all. And they're going to need that presence. But so do you and I need the presence of God. Every day, every step. And we can count on that presence, the presence of him who created you and me, who never has to say, oops. And the same can be said about the church. The church in general, but Chadbourne Baptist Church. When God led to the creation of this church, the establishment of this church, back in 1890, that was not a mistake. God has never had to look back and say, oops, about Chadbourne Baptist Church. This church has a great history. I came to be your pastor at a wonderful time. I started on April 22nd of 1990, when we were about 2 to 3 weeks from celebrating our 100th anniversary. And it was a great time to learn the history of this church and to meet some former pastors and to understand what had happened because of this church in this community. And folks, what God started in 1890 doesn't have to stop. It can continue. And God is going to be present, just as the psalmist says, his presence is never away. And this church can say, as the psalmist said, for it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. That I know very well. The psalmist understands that just because of the fact God created him, he's a marvel. And that's what he says in this psalm. He's a marvel in his own body which God had given him. All of Yahweh's creations are marvelous. Chadbourne Baptist Church is among the marvelous of God's creations. And I remind you today that the same goes about you and me, that God never has to say oops. And Same goes for Chadburn Baptist Church. God never has to, never has, and never will say, oops. This church can have a bright future as much as it has a strong past. And I encourage you to keep moving forward. I pray for you as you prepare to call your next pastor, whoever God is preparing that to be. And I encourage you to walk strongly in faith, knowing God created this church. You have the privilege to be a part of this church now and going forward. And that when God called you as an individual, and when God called this church, He never has to say, oops. I hope you will feel good and feel strong about the presence of God and be able to say, as the psalmist said, I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. Semicolon. And then the psalmist says, that I know very well. And I know that very well, having served as your pastor and knowing your history, having been connected to you through the years since 1997, but seeing the path forward God has given you. You can say, that I know very well. Wonderful are your works. And you can say that and believe that as strongly as a man named Pete Jones. I close with telling you about Pete Jones. Who is he? He's a man from Davidson County who grew up in Laurinburg. Was actually baptized in First Baptist Church where I was the pastor there. One of the men who's in that church now, who's close to 90, brought Pete Jones, and Pete's in his mid-80s now, brought him to First Baptist Church one time when Pete was about 10. And he gave his life to the Lord and was baptized that day in First Baptist Church in Laurinburg. He graduated from college. He went on and got his job at North Davidson High School, where my boys all went to school. During the 10 years that we lived there, and I went to game after game after game, I never got to meet, just never encountered this man Pete Jones. But I understand he was at every ball game. The gymnasium is even named after him. And he coached football, and he coached basketball, and taught at that school, and is a legend there. And I never got to meet him. But one Sunday after we moved to Laurinburg, our family went to lunch at Burger King. And I saw a man with a golf shirt that said North Davidson in there. And I went up and introduced myself, and this was a group of 4 men who had been to the beach to play golf. And we talked about North Davidson, and he happened to introduce me to his 3 buddies. One of them was this man, Pete Jones. And I finally got to meet him in Laurinburg, where he was from. But he coached for years, is a legend still. I mentioned the gym is named after him. My son Luke was the only one of the 3 who played varsity basketball at North Davidson. And during Luke's senior year, as the team would get ready for the excitement of the starting lineups being called out. That's one of my most fun times at a ball game, watching that and how the players celebrate and do their fancy handshakes like they can do. And when Luke was a senior and on that team, he didn't start, but he was the one who stood out on the court. And when every player came out, every starter came out, he had a special handshake with every one of them. And I don't know how guys do that, but I loved watching that. But that senior year of Luke's, which would have been in the fall of 13, before the basketball game started and before the starting lineups were started, they would play a recording of all the players. And again, this is the gymnasium named for Pete Jones. All the players would say, I'm so-and-so, and this is my house. Of course, I loved hearing Luke on the microphone, on the recording, saying, I'm Luke McDowell, and this is my house. And after all 12 players said their name and said, this is my house, the last voice on that recording was Pete Jones. And he would say, I'm Pete Jones, and this is my house. And that still gives me chills when I say it. But to hear that recording, of course, to hear your own child, but to hear that gentleman for whom the gym is named, and it is his house. he would say, I'm Pete Jones, and this is my house. And this is Chadbourn Baptist Church. And this isn't your house or my house. This is God's house. And we have the privilege to be a part of it. To be a part of it, because God made you, and God made me, and God made this church wonderfully. And the psalmist said, I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, that I know very well. And may it be so for Chadbourn Baptist Church all the years ahead. Because God can continue to work here. God will continue to work here. You know what else? About Chadbourn Baptist Church, God never has to say oops, because God is never Clemson when it comes to Chadbourn Baptist